Good afternoon. My name is Janet Solberg, and I am the chairperson of the Toronto Workmen Circle Foundation. I want to welcome everyone to this 82nd commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April the 19th, 1943. We are commemorating the singular importance of this event in Jewish history. But here at the Workmen Circle, we also view this commemoration as a yortsayt for those who've lost family in the ghetto and in the Holocaust. Every year we invite a speaker to this event, and I'm so honored and pleased to say that this year, Samuel Kassow will be our speaker. There are few people more qualified to speak about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Ghetto Uprising. To most people, the story of the Warsaw Ghetto is about a daring battle waged by a Jewish fighting force, hopelessly outnumbered, hopelessly armed, holding off the full might of the German army for weeks. A story of unimaginable defiance and resistance. But the truth is, the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto started years earlier with soup kitchens and house committees, with choral groups and orchestras, theater performances and poetry readings, with libraries and schools. This early nonviolent resistance will be Sam Kassow's focus. He will be looking at one of the most remarkable and significant examples of cultural resistance in the Holocaust, namely the secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, codenamed the Onik Shabbos Archive, Joy of the Sabbath Archive. It is quite an unbelievable story, moving and insightful and singularly important to our understanding of life and death in the Warsaw Ghetto. The idea of resistance and resilience has also been on my mind lately. We were all shocked and horrified by the brutal, murderous attack on innocent Israelis on October the 7th. But we have also been scarred and changed by the reaction of family and friends and supposed allies in its aftermath. Whether our families came to Canada in the 1920s fleeing pogroms, or whether they arrived post-war as stateless refugees, many having been stuck in displaced persons camps, whether we are secular or religious, young or old, Zionist or Bundist, we have all been severely shaken by the mountains of anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories on social media, from the left and the right, and by the sheer rage and aggression shown towards Jews just because they are Jews. How do we cope with this? Most of my family and friends found like-minded people to discuss the events of the day itself and what occurred in the aftermath. We felt devastated and traumatized, and it was too hard to explain to others not affected that way. I still feel that way, even after more than 550 days since the massacre, the hostage-taking, the bombing, the prospect of a never-ending war. So I understand that it is easy to fall into despair and inaction. But if we are to take any lesson from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the lesson is resistance. The lesson is resilience. The lesson is fighting for the importance of Jewish continuity and the everlasting existence of our peoplehood. Let me end this introduction to the memorial by properly introducing Samuel Kassow, who is himself a child of Holocaust survivors born in a displaced persons camp in Germany. Sam Kassow is the Charles H. Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. He holds a PhD from Princeton University and is a Fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research. From 2006 until 2013, he was the lead historian for 2 galleries of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which opened in 2014. Professor Kassow is the author of Who Will Write Our History? Emanuel Ringelblum and the Secret Ghetto Archive, which received the Orbis Prize, was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, and has been translated into 8 languages. We will hear from Professor Kassow later, and now I welcome you to the program. Thank you.
Stille, stille, lo mir schweigen, Quorim wachsen dort. So oben See verpflanzt die Sonne im grünen See zum Blut. Es führen Wegen zu Ponar zu, es wird kein Weg zurück. Ist der Tate wo verschwunden und mit ihm das Glück. Stille Kind meins, wenn ich deutscher selbst nicht kein Gewehen. Unser Unglück willen Sohn im sei, wie nicht verstehen. Soben Brege sollt die Hirnen, soben euch etwises zusammen. Noch zu unser Pein kein Bissu Schein, kein Bissu Schein. Frühling Oyfn Land gekommen und uns Herbst gebracht. Ist der Tag heint voll mit Blumen und seit nur der Nacht. Goldig scheun der Herbst auf Stammen blüht in unser Zar. Bleibt verjossemt, wo am Mames Kind geht auf Ponar. Wie die Vilja geschmiedet euch, gejocht in Pein. Ziehen Kies als durch Lüte jetzt in Jammerein. Es wird der Heuschek, wo sie ruhen, von der finster leuchten Sonnen. Reiter, komm geschwind, ich ruf dein Kind, ich ruf dein Kind. Stilles Quellen quallen uns in Harz herum. Bis der Teuer wird nicht fallen, sein wir mussen stumm. Frei nicht Kind sich siehst, ein Schmeichel jetzt vor uns verrat. Sehn dem Frühling soll der Säune wie ein Herbst a Platz. Soll der Qual sich ruhig fließen, stille sei und hoff. Mit der Freiheit kommt der Tag, schlufsche Kind, mein Schlaf. Wie die Vilja aber freite, wie die Bäume grün beneite, leicht bald Freiheitslicht auf dein Gesicht, auf dein Gesicht.
Kommes, Haynt is yortsayt. Yortsayt, Haynt, a Zind. Wenn gerufen hat zu dir ein erstgeboren Kind. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schmeichel über Wald und Plain. Jeder hat Haynt yortsayt, noch sein Schwell, noch sich allein. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Regen 1943, noch ein letzten Karschenbäum und Schwellberle dabei. Haynt is yortsayt, noch mein Zeit, verfreuren in Ponar. Haynt is yortsayt, noch mein Mames gellen Samovar. Noch ein Schnee von meine Weißlen ausgeschneit, beschaß ich hab zugedeckt mit dem Käfer von mein Gas. Haynt is yortsayt, noch die 2 Malochen bei mein Bett. Haynt is yortsayt, noch ein Zoffenstern ergetät. Yortsayt noch ein Spiegel mit einem blauen Teich im Rahmen, wo es bäumten sich die Licht und Schottens von mein Stamm. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schabbes, rein wie ein Brillant. Haynt is yortsayt noch der Fiddle in mein Chavers Hand. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Leib in fredigen Antbläus. Haynt is yortsayt noch der letzte yortsayt Licht in Kleus. Yortsayt noch einen langen Säger auf der Wand vom Lehm. Oi, noch alle Wieglieder von unser Irrwe ein.
Today is yortsayt. God of vengeance, today is yortsayt. Today we mourn the day you were summoned by your firstborn. Today we mourn a smile which covered dell and wood. Today we mourn ourselves, our home and neighborhood. Today I mourn the rain in 1943, the last little swallow in the nearby cherry tree. Today I mark my time frozen in Pinar. Today I remember my mama's yellow samovar. The snow which the whites of my eyes have shed, and which covered my street, now the graves of my dead. Today I mourn the two angels by my bed, and the North Star somewhere overhead. I mourn the mirror with its lake blue frame, where bathe the light and shadows of my roots, my name. Today I mourn a Sabbath pristine and grand. Today I mourn the fiddle in my comrade's hand. Yortsayt for a body joyously in bloom, and for the last votive in the shul's small room. It's yortsayt for the tall clock upon the whitewashed wall, and for every lullaby of generations all.
A summons to remember. On the first Seder night in April 1943, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto took up arms against their Nazi overlords. It was the beginning of an epic battle, not for victory as the resistance fighters knew from the outset, but for the honor of their people. On the walls of the ghetto, they posted an 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not despair." It was their watchword and their legacy. When the battle was near its end, the few Jews who still survived issued an appeal to their brethren around the world. Remember us. Do not forget what we have suffered at the hands of our murderous enemy. Let our departure from the world in ashes and in smoke not be in vain. The Battle of the Ghetto glows in Jewish history. It is immortalized in scores of writings and sanctified in the annals of the human spirit. It has nourished the will of new generations to renew and fortify their national and cultural heritage. We will forever remember the fighters who fell in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Ayer, heylikn, zikorn. Alle meine Tag seien yortsayt-licht, ayer, heylikn, zikorn. Und alle Nacht mit Seewe-Stimme auf eure verschämte Quorum. Durch Berg von Asch und Räuchen schwarze, ich gehe zu euch von Stadt zu Stadt. Und sie ist durchschlagen von mein Herzen, das Wiederkoll von euer letzten Trott. Nur wo soll ich sein Spur jetzt suchen? Auf welche Stichen? Als alle Wegen hab mein Pein getragen und euer Blut hat die ganze Erde gezwungen. Jeden Menschen kommt 7 Tage von Treue. Wie viele Jahre soll mein Treue dauern, kedei zu sitzen Schive noch Millionen, a Volk a ganz in Wetig zu der Monnen. Seien alle meine Tage die Yortsayt-Licht, ayer, heylikn, zikorn, und alle Nacht mit Seewe-Stimme auf eure verschämte Quorum.
Zygelboim was elected to the Warsaw City Council in 1927. During the first months of the Nazi occupation in Poland, he was a key figure in the underground resistance movement in Warsaw. He was sent to Europe and North America to raise awareness of what was happening to the Jews of Poland. However, his audience was incredulous or indifferent. Even as the Nazis were liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto, his pleas fell on deaf ears. 2023 is the 80th anniversary of his death and his final testament on behalf of our people. Ich kann nicht bleiben still. Ich kann nicht leben, wenn die Rechtslach von jüdischen Volk in Polen, demens Vorsteher ich bin, werden umgebracht. Meine Chaverim in Warsaw Ghetto seien umgekommen mit Gewehr in Hand in den letzten heroischen Gerangel. Ich gehöre zu sie und sehr Massenquoren. Mit mein Teut will ich ausdrücken dem stärksten Protest gegen der Passivkeit, mit welcher die Welt guckt sich zu und erlässt die Ausrottung vom jüdischen Volk. Mein Leben gehört zum jüdischen Volk in Polen und dafür gebe ich es ihm weg.
Brent is a song written in 1936. It has been used after the war to commemorate the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto. This is Teresa Tova's dramatic and heartfelt interpretation of the song.
Böse Winden mit ihr Gossen, Reisen brechen und zerbläusen, starker noch die wilde Flammen, als Rom schon brennt. Und steht und guckt so sich mit verlegte Händ. Und steht und guckt so sich, unser Städtel brennt. Brennt, Brüder, es brennt. Und unsere Ohren steht und der Berg brennt. So schon die Pfeilzungen das ganze Städtel eingeschlungen und die böse Winden huschen, unser Städtel brennt. Und steht und guckt so sich mit verlegte Händ. Und steht und guckt so sich, unser Städtel brennt. Se brennt, Brüderlich, es brennt. Unser Städtel unser Stott mit uns zusammen soll auf Asch weg in Flammen bleiben soll wie noch eine Schlacht, noch Pust der schwarze Wind. Und steht und guckt so sich mit verlegte Händ. Und steht und guckt so sich, unser Städtel brennt. Es brennt, Brüderlich, es brennt. Die Hilfe ist nur in euch allein gewähnt. Ob das Städtel ist euch teuer, nehmt die Kehlin, lässt das Feuer, lässt mit euer eigen Blut, beweist, dass ihr doch kennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, unter sich mit verlegte Händ. Steht nicht, Brüder, lässt das Feuer, unser Städtel brennt.
Today, I'd like to talk about one of the most successful examples of cultural resistance in the Holocaust. And I'm referring specifically to the secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, codenamed the Onyx Shabbos Archive, Joy of the Sabbath Archive, the secret archive that was organized by the historian Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum. On March 1st, 1944, just a week before he was captured and murdered by the Germans, Dr. Ringelblum wrote one of his last letters to a friend of his, Adolf Berman, who, like Ringelblum himself, was hiding out on the Aryan side of German-occupied Warsaw. And in that letter, Ringelblum asked a question. If we're caught, if none of us survive the end of the war, remember, he was writing this in March 1944, but if none of us survive the end of the war, what will happen to the OS? That was the code name for the Onyx Shabbos archive. What will happen to our archive that they had buried? And Ringelblum had good reason to worry, because by the time the Germans surrendered a year later, of the 60 or so men and women that Ringelblum recruited into this archive, there were only 3 survivors: Hirschwasser, his wife, and Rachel Auerbach. And of the 3 survivors, only one, Hirschwasser, knew where they had buried these documents, under a Jewish school in the Warsaw Ghetto at Nowolipki Street, number 68. Wasser himself had survived by the slimmest of margins, once actually jumping from a train that was taking him to Treblinka. So when the war was over, Auerbach and the Wassers cajoled, begged, pleaded, buttonholed everybody they could to organize a search to find those documents. But finding those documents was not very easy, because if anyone has seen pictures of what Warsaw looked like after the war, it was just literally a big heap of rubble after the bombing in 1939, after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, after the Polish Uprising in 1944. The city was just rubble. And so to say, well, we buried something on Nowolipki 68, it was hard to even know where the street had been, much less where a house had been. But using some pre-war aerial photographs and using the fact that a spire of a church was still standing, surveyors were able to kind of figure out where in the ruins the building had once been. And with money from the Jewish Labor Committee and the Joint Distribution Committee, and if I'm not mistaken, from the Workmen Circle, a search began. And on September 18th, 1946, the shovels hit what turned out to be the first of 10 tin boxes. These tin boxes were the first cache of the archive that Ringelblum had buried in August 1942. A lot of water had seeped into those boxes. Many documents were ruined. Many pictures were ruined. Wasser said, we have to keep on digging because we buried a lot more, but that's all they could find. In the meantime, of course, as we all know, Poland became a communist dictatorship. Wasser, his wife, Bluma, Rachel Auerbach, all left Poland to go to Israel. And then 4 years later, in December 1950, as Polish construction workers were building new apartment houses on the ruins of the old ghetto, they discovered 2 aluminum milk cans. These aluminum milk cans were the second cache of the archive that had been buried in February 1943. And unlike the tin boxes, the milk cans protected the documents very, very well. Now, there's a backstory about this. When the Polish workers saw the aluminum milk cans, they said, well, my God, these Jews must have buried dollars and diamonds and gold watches. And when they saw that they were just paper, they were going to throw it all away. But then their foreman came back from a lunch break, and the foreman, Wojcik, said, no, we have to take these documents to the Jewish Historical Commission. So if the foreman hadn't come back from the lunch break, this second cache would have been gone forever. But we have it. Now, according to Hirschwasser, there was a third cache that they buried in April 1943, just 1 week before the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They buried this on the grounds of the brushmaker shop, Świętojarska 34, which was the scene of very heavy fighting during the uprising. Marek Edelman of the Bund was commanding that unit. After the war, that became the site of the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. There were sporadic attempts to find that third cache, most recently in 2002, I think, but nobody had any luck. So as we can tell, although many documents were lost, nevertheless, we still have about 30 to 35,000 readable documents and artifacts. And the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw has just finished an amazing project to publish all these documents, 36 volumes. So it's an enormous amount of material, and they're also publishing 10 volumes in English of selected documents. Now, the question that I want to pose to you, and the reason why I say that this is such an amazing example of successful cultural resistance, the question that I want you to ask yourselves is, why is this important? Why does this matter? And it goes to the title that I chose for my book. When I wrote my book about the Oynik Shabbos archive, the title that I chose was, Who Will Write Our History? Who will write our history? The Germans thought that they were going to win the war and that they would write the history of what happened, and they would decide if the Jews would be remembered. And of course, the Germans would have reminded the world that by exterminating this race of subhumans and vermin, they and the Fuhrer Adolf Hitler had done mankind a great favor. Emanuel Ringelblum's history teacher, Isaac Schipper, who was murdered in Majdanek, said just before he was killed to his fellow inmate, he said this, what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. Think about that. What we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. And Emanuel Ringelblum knew in the Warsaw Ghetto that he had to launch a battle for memory. He had to make sure that even if he died, even if the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were wiped out, even if Polish Jewry was wiped out, that they would leave time capsules buried under the ground. And someday those time capsules would come to the surface and people would be able to write about the Jews, not as a mass of nameless victims, not as a mass of 500,000 people destroyed, but as a community of individuals, a community with aspirations, with ideals, a community that fought the good fight to maintain their dignity, to fight back against hunger, a community that tried the best it could against all the odds to maintain its national pride. And this is one of the great achievements of the Oyfn Shabbos archive. Just imagine what would have happened had the archive not been found. And as we know, it came very close to staying in the ground forever. Had the archive not been found, how could we have written any histories of the Warsaw Ghetto? All of this wonderful scholarship of Israel Gutman and Basha Engelking and Jacek Liotchak and the wonderful Israeli scholar Havi Dreyfus, none of this could have been written. Any history of the Warsaw Ghetto would have depended on German documents. We could have written about the perpetrators. We could have written about Polish attitudes towards the Jews. Yes, there would have been survivor memoirs, but remember that of the 500,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, less than 2% survived. And as we're going to see, survivor memoirs are very different from the real-time writing that we have in the archive. Had the archive not been found, we would have had no Ringelblum diary. We would have had no Avram Levin diary. We would not have had the 3,600 pages of the Jewish underground press in the Warsaw Ghetto. We would not have had the theological writings of the Piaseczner Rebbe. We would not have had the poetry of Yitzhak Katz Nelson. All of this would have vanished for good. Now, the fact that the archive surfaced and the fact that we could write the history of the ghetto based on Jewish sources reminds us that when we think about resistance in the war, when we think about Jewish resistance, we have to remember that Jews resisted not just with guns. Very, very few people had access to guns. Jews also resisted with paper and pen. Paper and pen became important weapons. And this took place not just in the Warsaw Ghetto, but everywhere where Jews tried to survive under Nazi occupation. The great historian Shimon Dubnov, just before he was led away to his execution in Riga in 1941, yelled out, "Jiden verschreibt," Jews, write everything down. In 1946, in the ruins of crematorium number 3 in Auschwitz-Birkenau, we found glass bottles stuffed with the writings of Zalman Gradovsky, a member of the Sonderkommando. In the ruins of the Vilna Ghetto, we found the diary of Hermann Kruk, the librarian of the Vilna Ghetto, which he continued in a concentration camp in Estonia. And the last entry in that diary was written the same day that he was murdered. There were also underground archives. There were archives in the Vilna Ghetto, in the Bialystok Ghetto. There was an archive in the Lodz Ghetto. But the Oyfn Shabbos was the biggest of the Jewish archives, probably the biggest clandestine archive, Jewish or non-Jewish, in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. And it differed and it was unique in many ways. First of all, as I said, it was a collective. Ringelblum brought together 60 people. He understood that the task of documenting the Jewish experience during the war, this is beyond the capability of one individual. This has to be a collective effort. So he brought together men and women. He brought together rabbis and Zionists and Bundists and communists. He brought together the famous and the not so famous. People buried the hatchet. They forgot their differences, almost, but usually, and they worked together in a common cause to serve the Jewish people and to protect the memory of the Jewish victims. The archive was very well organized. There was an executive committee that met every Saturday afternoon, hence the code name Oynik Shabbos. They raised money. They decided who they would recruit. They decided what the archive would concentrate on at any given time. There was a what was called the physical committee, for want of a better translation. This consisted of a teacher and two of his students, Israel Lichtenstein and two teenagers. Only they had possession of the documents as they came into the archive, and only they, Ringelblum and two others, knew where those documents were. That was a security measure. So only 6 people knew where the documents were at any one time. One of the most important functions of the archive was the corps of interviewers. The archive had to get information, not just from Warsaw, but what was going on all over Poland. And so as the Germans dumped over 100,000 refugees in the Warsaw Ghetto, the archive sent members into the refugee centers to interview people from different cities and get information what was going on. And this resulted in more than 400 different essays from towns outside of Warsaw. Now, it wasn't just a question of going and conducting an interview. The refugee centers were the focal points of the typhus pandemic. The mortality rate was very high. When you went into these places, your risk of getting typhus was very, very great. There was almost no access to vaccines. Many of these interviewers died of the disease, but they kept at it. Another point to remember about the archive, and one reason why it was so successful, is that it was wound up into it was embedded in a big organization in the Warsaw Ghetto called the Lamentations for the self-help. The self-help ran schools, soup kitchens, refugee centers, daycare centers. It was until Pearl Harbor, until Germany and America broke diplomatic relations in December 1941, the Lamentations was getting money from the Joint Distribution Committee. And that meant that the Germans respected it to some degree. The Lamentations provided ideal cover for the archive. The entire leadership of the archive was also in the Lamentations. Under the camouflage of the Lamentations, people could get information. They could get information about what was going on. There was money to pay the staff of the Oynik Shabbos. There was money to get the materials. So without the Lamentations, the archive could not function as effectively as it did. When America and Germany went to war after December 1941, the money still kept coming in. What the Joint did in the Warsaw Ghetto was they went to very wealthy Jews and they said, look, give us money now and we'll give you a chit. And when the war is over and you survive, the Joint in New York will pay you back. And this was a way of keeping the funds going for relief in the ghetto and for the archive itself. Now, the agendas of the archive evolved over time. Now, remember that the archive was begun in November 1940. The Germans did not decide until sometime in late 1941 to murder all the Jews. So if the Germans didn't know that they were going to kill all the Jews until a relatively late date, you can't expect the members of the archive to know. So in understanding the evolving agendas of the archive, you had to understand what they knew at any point in time. So the basic priority from the very beginning was what they called in Yiddish to zammel, to collect information, collect diaries, collect essays, also collect material markers, candy wrappers, theater tickets, theater posters, restaurant menus. Yes, there were fancy restaurants in the ghetto where the speculators and the Jewish police and informers and people with cash would come together and make deals. Children's essays from the ghetto schools, and this collection went on right until the end. In 1941, there was a second agenda item. The leaders of the archive, and remember that Emanuel Ringelblum, Yitzhak Gitterman, the other leaders of the archive had all been active in the YIVO before the war. If you are part of the Workman Circle, I don't have to tell you what the YIVO was, but it was an organization founded in Vilna in 1925 to bring together scholars and ordinary Jews to study the day-to-day life of the Jewish people, to raise the prestige of the Yiddish language, to give the Jews of Eastern Europe more self-confidence by creating archives, by giving them a sense of their own culture and their own history. One of the great mottos of the YIVO, this is a pun, was Wissenschaft. Wissenschaft, of course, is the Yiddish word for science or knowledge, but Wissenschaft means if you know, you're able to do something, you're able to create. So before the war, the YIVO sponsored autobiography contests, they sponsored questionnaires, they encouraged Jews to write the histories of their own town, to take pictures of old buildings, cemeteries, and the Oynik Shabbos continued this in the Warsaw Ghetto, and the project that they decided to launch would be a major study of Jewish life under the Nazi occupation in Poland. And they did this in 1941 when they didn't know that the Germans planned to kill them. That is, the idea was that we would somehow survive this war, and then the knowledge that we gained about how we acted during the war would help us rebuild the community later. So the project had 80 different topics, women, Jewish children, corruption, religious life, Polish-Jewish relations, and so on. Each topic had a team leader to put together questionnaires and to decide who would be interviewed. Some members of the archive were team leaders of 4 or 5 different topics. And the idea was that this would result in a book of 1,600 pages. But unfortunately, this project was in full swing when in July 1942, the Germans suddenly began the mass deportations to Treblinka, deporting 7,000 Jews a day to the gas chambers with the help of the Jewish police in the ghetto. That was a horrible summer. During that summer, you could tell that Emanuel Ringelblum himself was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He could barely write a complete sentence. His handwriting changed. He was torn between his sense of obligation to the archive on the one hand, and his natural desire as a father and a husband to go into hiding and try to save himself, his wife, and his son. Every day, another key member of the archive was taken to the death trains. The 60 became 50, became 40, became 30. And you ask yourselves, how did they go on? How did they keep working when their world was collapsing all around them? A partial answer can be found in an unfinished essay by another member of the archive, Gustava Jarecka, a woman who worked in the Judenrat, and with her Judenrat pass, Ringelblum thought that she would be able to walk the streets during the deportation and write down what she saw, describing how they loaded children and entire families onto the wagons. And Jarecka wrote an amazing essay, which she did not complete because she and her 2 children were deported to Treblinka. But part of that essay survived in the milk cans. And one of the things she wrote was, how could you have blamed us Jews? How could you have blamed us Jews for having thought that the history of mankind is a history of progress, that somehow we evolved from savages to barbarians to decent people. How could we have known that in 1942, in the middle of the 20th century, as the most educated nation in Europe is murdering children in the streets, how could we have known that it was just the opposite, that history's wheel is moving in the direction not of decency, but of savagery? And if that is the case, then here is my hope. And now I'm quoting her directly, that someday, if somebody reads what I'm writing, may these documents be like a stone under history's wheel, like a stone under history's wheel. People will, in other words, read what I'm writing and say, oh my God, how could we have allowed this to happen? How could we have allowed this to have taken place? Let's make sure that such a disaster never happens again. During the course of 1942, a number of escapees from the actual death camps arrived in the Warsaw Ghetto. One, his name was Szlamek Wiener, escaped from Chełmno, the first death camp, which murdered 250,000 Jews in the Lodz region. And then in the summer and fall of 1942, there were about 5 escapees from Treblinka. One of these escapees, Avram Kshepitsky, was taken in hand by the Oyfn Shabbos archive, interviewed by Rachel Auerbach, and the record of the interview comes to more than 100 type pages in Yiddish. Grodowski, who escaped from Chełmno, was also interviewed in great detail by the Oyfn Shabbos. And in fact, this interview in late February 1942 was the first ever firsthand account of a Nazi death camp. The Oyfn Shabbos put together all of this information and included them in 4 reports that were sent with the help of the Bund and the Polish Socialist Party to London, to the Polish government in exile in London, where they were shared with the British government and the American government. The last report sent by the Oyfn Shabbos in November 1942 even had a detailed map of Treblinka, which was drawn by Kshepitsky. This was an account of how the death camp was functioning, even as it was still working full swing. Ringelblum's motto was "Right now," WRITE, right now, write immediately, don't wait until tomorrow. Man muss verschreiben auf der heißer Minute, as he said in his essay, because tomorrow, who knows if you'll be alive? Tomorrow, you might have seen things that'll turn you into a different person. Write what you see and keep writing and don't stop. Ringelblum instinctively understood the difference between real-time testimony and survivor testimony. He knew that the survivors, if they survived, having known what happened, would focus on different things. Whereas the people in the Warsaw Ghetto, not knowing what would happen tomorrow, they were expressing the genuine reactions, the genuine emotions, the aspirations, the hopes, the fears of people who were living inside the event. And thanks to the Oyfn Shabbos, we have the last voices of Polish Jewry as they were recorded in real time. The children's essays of June 1942, written in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish. The theme, what do I want to be when the war is over? We have the sermons of the great Hasidic Rebbe, the Piaseczner Rebbe, wrestling with the theological implications of the Holocaust. Why is God allowing this to happen to us? We have the writings of a ghetto mailman, Peretz Opachinsky, who is describing how at the height of the deportations, the Germans put a few Jewish toddlers on a bench in the middle of a street in the blazing sun, and these toddlers are crying for their parents. And the Germans are not allowing Jews to go up to these toddlers and give them water and give them food. And Opachinsky writes, the Germans didn't have to put that bench there. They did it just so we could suffer a little bit more, just so we could suffer a little bit more. We also have the writing of a Yiddish writer, Shia Perle, who was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. But he writes down that in late August 1942, on August 25th to be exact, Perle sees a Jewish policeman dragging a little 5-year-old boy to his SS handler and saying, "This is my 5th head of the day." Now, the Jewish police had to provide 5 Jews a day, and if they didn't make their quota, they were told they and their families would be deported. So the Jewish police turned into bloodhounds. So this Jewish policeman is dragging this little kid to the SS man and says, "This is my 5th head of the day." The SS man calmly pulls out a pistol, shoots the little boy, and as the little boy is dying on the pavement, the SS man very casually tells the Jewish policeman, "This little dog doesn't count as a head. Go get me an adult." And the Jewish policeman scampers off to get an adult. And that day, Perle wrote something that I'm sure he never would have written had he survived. Perle wrote this. He said, "How could such a people produce such scum as the Jewish police?" And now, listen to this. A people that produces such scum as the Jewish police is a people that deserves everything it's getting. Now, after the war, this would have been unthinkable. We talked about the 6 million, we talked about the Kedoshim, we talked about the martyrs. But the idea that you would say something about fellow Jews, this wouldn't happen after the war. But this illustrates a number of very important points. One, a critical difference between real-time writing and post-war writing. Real-time writing is full of anger against other Jews because most Jews didn't see Germans that much. They saw fellow Jews, and there was anger. And there was also despair. Remember, people saw the nation being destroyed, and they didn't even have the consolation of knowing that there would be a Jewish state after the war. They didn't even know that the Jewish people would survive. So you could imagine the despair. But when you think about what Perle just wrote, there's something else to think about. Now, this was found in the aluminum milk can, which means Ringelblum read it. Now, you ask yourself, Ringelblum could have said, "My God, this doesn't make us look good. I'm going to tear this up. This isn't going in." But Ringelblum insisted that everything go in, the good and the bad. Because, yes, there was a lot of evidence of corruption and demoralization. And there were a lot of documents that echoed what Perle said. But Ringelblum, the trained historian, said that because I'm putting this in, future historians will believe me. They will trust the objectivity of the archive. And Ringelblum also believed in the facts. He didn't believe in alternative facts. And believing in the facts, he thought that when all was said and done, the weight of the archive would show future historians that on the whole, the Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto were okay. The hundreds of thousands of Jews who did what they could with no contacts, no money, no hope of survival, but they did what they could to help their families, help their neighbors, and maintain their dignity. Now, Emanuel Ringelblum was caught in the Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto, deported to the Travniki labor camp, where he made a daring escape in August 1943. And he arrived on the Aryan side of Warsaw and went into a big hideout, which contained 37 Jews, including his wife and son. And he was in that hideout from September 1943 until March 1944, when all of the Jews were betrayed and murdered by the Germans. In that hideout, he literally wrote hundreds more pages. Polish-Jewish relations during the war. He wrote about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He wrote about the Yiddish writers and poets who were murdered by the Germans. He remained true to his mission as a historian right until the very end. When Ringelblum and the other Jews were taken to the Paviak prison in March 1944, there was a Yiddish journalist, Yechiel Hirshout, who was already in the prison. And when they heard that Ringelblum was there, they struggled to find some way to keep him alive. They figured maybe they could pay off some of the SS men and take Ringelblum out of the cell where he was being held and smuggle him into the general prison population. And Hirshout records in his book, Finstere Nacht in Paviak, that he went into the cell where Ringelblum was being held. He'd been badly tortured. His face was black and blue. His son was sitting on his lap. And Hirshout outlined the plan to get him out of the cell. And Ringelblum said, "What about my boy? What about my wife?" Hirshout said, "No, we can't save them." And Ringelblum said, I'm not going to leave them." And the last words that Hirshout remembers Ringelblum telling him was looking at his little son and saying in Yiddish, "Was ist schuldig der Kleiner, zu liebem weitig mir stark das Herz." Why is this little one guilty? Because of him, my heart is breaking. The next day, March 10th, all of these Jews were murdered by the Germans. I want to end this talk by going back to the night of August 3rd, 1942, when Israel Lichtenstein and these two teenage boys were ordered by Ringelblum to bury the first cache of the archive, and they were stuffing the documents into the tin cans. And the Germans were only 100 yards away. 100,000 Jews had already been deported. They didn't know if they would be alive the next day. And as they were hurriedly stuffing the tin cans with documents, they were also writing their last wills and testaments. And those survived and were read in 1946. And Lichtenstein said in his last will and testament, "I've given my whole life to this archive. I want to be remembered. I want my wife, Gela Sexting, to be remembered, a great artist. She designed sets for the children's theater in the ghetto. I want my little daughter, Margalit, to be remembered. She's 20 months old, but she speaks a beautiful Yiddish, and she equals 4-year-olds in intelligence. And if you don't believe me, ask her teachers." And then he actually added the name of some of her teachers. I believe that the Jewish people will survive. The Jews of Eastern Europe are a redeeming sacrifice for the Jewish people. And so in the very end of his life, Israel Lichtenstein reminded us that the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, indeed all the Polish Jews, were not just the mass of faceless, nameless victims, but they were part of a resilient nation. And this is the real legacy of the Oynik Shabbos Archive. Thank you.
Neshames von jüdischer Stadt, behalten in die Palmeten von Ewigkeit. Werden sie aufstehen von Toll, von Teut, wird auf sie ablosten die Sehung von Leben. Nur du, mein Gott, weißt, wie stark sie seinen gewähren, weil du hast sie gebeugt mit ein verstandiger Gwure. Nur du, mein Gott, hast gewusst, wie schwach sie seinen gewähren, eder sie seinen weg mit dem Räuch. Du hast nicht geschützt, die jüdische Stadt, sie nicht verfestigt, seinen See wie die heilige Oysis abgesprungen von Leben. Jetzt hängen Possele Nemmen auf Beistidlen von Wüste Wegen, alle Grenzen von dein Welt seinen Tome. Kommen die Neshames von jüdischer Stadt weinen vor dem Kisse Jakobet. Gott, Baruch Hu, sehr wie grindlich Khurbn wir seinen. Du hast uns erschaffen in dein Gestalt, jetzt ist dein Welt ein Stück Guf, Adomen. Die Getzflecker klingen jetzt die Namen von Städt. Warsaw, Wilna, Chalem, Lublin. In Tag, wenn ich will bauen mein Haus, euch vergessen will ich in die jüdische Stadt, so verstummt werden mein Zung und vertreurig werden die Hand, was beut Gottes Haus auf dem Berg, auf ein Fundament von so viel vergessen ist. Verwirrt der Schlaf, der nicht Rimmler und nicht Schlafer. Lass sich vorlehnen die gestorbenen Namen von die heilige jüdische Stadt. Schmeckt der Semmelmehl von seiner Jüdischkeit. Es geht auf Errachnen, was hat sich abgetan von der ganzen Welt. Es weinen tausende Kinderschere.
Unter die polishe grininke beymelekh spielen sich mehr nicht keyn moyshalech shloimelech. Spielen sich mehr nicht kein soralech lealech. Nicht auf kein gräserlech, nicht auf kein schneelech. Schilchen schein mehr nicht die jüdische Stiemelech, von die Kundesimlech, Motelech, Schiemelech, mit die zerkrellte, zidrapete Zuralech, von dem Beweisen, von der ihm und Gwuralech. Streuer sind die polishe beymelekh, teut seinen jiddische heimen und heymelekh, teut seinen gesselech, choref die heiselech, wo es verstechen sich Kinder wie Meiselach. Jiddische Kinder mit große Egelech, schwarze Hasoi wie mit Heuschech, verzeugene Egelech volle mit Pachet verlaufenen, unter dem Unglück dem Bräunem getroffenen. Unter die polishe grininke beymelekh spielten sich mehr nicht kein moyshalech shloimelech. Spielten sich mehr nicht kein soralech lealech. Nicht auf kein gräserlech, nicht auf kein schneelech.
Oyfn khurbn von mein heim von Malkeli. Ich zind mein Treuer wie Yortsayt-Lichter, noch eich martierel heylikn Gesichter, Yortsayt-Licht noch mein heim. Wie die Kedoshim, ihr seid gestorben. Mit euch wird leuchten unser Morgen, ihr wird keinmal nicht vergehen. Wie der Phönix von die Stäuben, von Asch sich wieder aufgehäuben, so wird ihr aufgehen. Von die Oyfns, von die Flammen, von dritten Hurben aufgestanden, mein Volk wird nicht vergehen. Du, mein Kind, du wirst mich erben. Ein Volk darf leben und nicht sterben. Ich schreibe für dir das Lied. Du sollst dem vor dem weiter spinnen. Mein Volk soll wachsen und soll grinen. Gedenk, du bist der Jid. Du, mein Kind, von Stamm a Zweigel. Vor mein Dor du sollst, nicht schweigen. Gedenk die Nazi-Schlang. Unser Volk wird sich zerzweigen. Mit neuer
Es zieht sich durch endlose Deures und zieht, der gewaltige Völkergeschleck. Es zittert das Schlachtfeld mir unter die Tritt, ich gehe mir als weiter mein Weg. Durch Samt und durch Derner, durch Stein und durch Bein, ich gehe und ich will noch ausgehen. Ich hab mit den Sotten Hamaschkes allein geschlossen an ewigen Bund. Das Feuer, es soll mich nicht brennen. Das Wasser, es soll mich nicht schlingen. Der Spie soll mich stechen nicht kennen. Die Keul soll zurück von mir springen. Ich fühl, ich bin stärker von allen Jesuren, von menschlicher Bösheit und Streit, und stärker von Wasser, von Feuer, von Sturm, und stärker a vielu von Zeit. Es seien von mir durch die tausender Jahren die Maluches die Gräste gegangen verloren, die Völker die stärkste vertilgt geworden, und Weltstädte zerackert in Salz. Und riesige Berg seinen lang schon zerschotten, und ewige Wälder zerfeult und zertrotten, und mächtige Felsen zerweicht und zerknotten. Ich leb und gedeih noch aus. Ich leb und ich will noch ausleben durch tausender Jahren von Streit. Ich will noch ausleben und kämpfen und streben, und Temp ist der Zorn von der Zeit.
Against the letzten Weg, euch niemand neue, verstellen neue Weg. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird auch heute unser Volk mir sein ein Lob. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird auch heute unser Volk mir sein ein Lob. Baumenland des weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen heran mit unser Kleid, unser Reh. Und ungebaut ist das Schmerz von unser Blut. Schwarzen Welt auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Und ungebaut ist das Schmerz von unser Blut. Schwarzen Welt auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Die Morgen sind vergilden unser Heim. Und der Merken wird verschwinden wie den Wein. Nur euch zusammen wird die Sonne in Kajor. Die Chaos und jenes Leben von dort zu go. Nur euch zusammen wird die Sonne in Kajor. Die Chaos und jenes Leben von dort zu go. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Wein. Es ist nicht ein Leben ohne Freude und der Frei. Das Wort kommt zwischen Frauen nicht gewählt. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Welt. Das Wort kommt zwischen Frauen nicht gewählt. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Welt. Das soll nicht länger als der ganze letzten Weg. Von Stimmen meine verschnellen neue Weg. Trugen weg nach unser Haus gewinnt